The morning air at Quantico National Cemetery carried the weight of autumn, crisp and reverent, beneath a sky the color of polished steel. Franklin Hayes stepped off the bus at 800 hours, his worn leather shoes touching Virginia soil for the first time in over 2 decades. At 73, his shoulders still held the ghost of military bearing, though time had rounded them slightly, like old stone worn smooth by decades of carrying invisible burdens. His uniform hung perfectly pressed despite the 5-hour journey. From North Carolina, deep green wool that had faded to something closer to sage, brass buttons dulled but polished, creases sharp enough to cut paper. No ribbons decorated his chest, no medals caught the morning light. Just a single unit patch on his shoulder. 3rd Reconnaissance Battalion, a designation that existed in no official records and lived only in the memories of men who'd sworn never to speak its name. Franklin clutched a single white lily wrapped in faded cloth, its petals already beginning to curl at the edges. He'd bought it from a gas station in Richmond during his transfer, the only flower they had that seemed appropriate for saying goodbye to someone who'd once been closer than blood. Funeral of General Marcus Connors had drawn the kind of crowd reserved for American legends. 4-star generals, defense secretaries, foreign dignitaries, and enough brass to outfit a small army. Security barriers lined the cemetery entrance, guards checking identification with military precision, turning away anyone whose name didn't appear on the carefully curated guest list. Franklin approached the gate slowly, each step deliberate. The young sergeant manning the checkpoint, polished shoes, pressed blues, barely old enough to vote, stepped forward with practiced authority. "I'm sorry, sir. This is a restricted area for a private funeral service. Do you have clearance?" Franklin's pale blue eyes, cloudy around the edges but still steady, met the guard's gaze. "I served with him," he said simply, his voice carrying the quiet strength of a man who'd learned long ago that the loudest voices rarely said the most important things. The sergeant frowned, consulting his clipboard. "Are you on the guest list? Family member?" Franklin shook his head once. "Just came to pay my respects." "I'm sorry, sir. Without proper credentials, I can't allow entry." Franklin didn't argue, didn't raise his voice or demand to speak to someone higher up the chain of command. He simply nodded once and stepped aside, taking position near the outer stone wall where he could see the American flags rippling in the breeze beyond the iron gates. Inside, the ceremony began with military precision. The honor guard marched. In perfect formation, bagpipes played their mournful song, and speeches were delivered by men who'd known Marcus Connors, the general, the strategist, the legend. But outside the gates, Franklin Hayes stood alone with a wilted flower, the only man present who'd known Marcus Connors, the 19-year-old lieutenant who'd nearly died in a place that officially didn't exist, saved by a sergeant whose name would never appear in any citation. The irony wasn't lost on him. The most important person at General Marcus Connors' funeral was the one man they wouldn't let inside. Colonel Logan Marks had been General Connors' aide-de-camp for 3 years, long enough to know the stories that lived in the spaces between official reports. Standing near the main reception tent, adjusting the ceremonial arrangements for the 3rd time, he caught sight of movement beyond the security perimeter. An old man in a faded uniform stood motionless against the outer wall, patient as a sentinel. Something about the figure struck Logan as familiar, though he couldn't place why. The unit patch on the man's shoulder was too far away to read clearly, but its placement and the way the stranger held himself suggested decades of military bearing. Logan excused himself from the reception line and approached the security checkpoint. "Sergeant Williams, who's the gentleman by the wall?" The young guard consulted his notes. "Says he served with the general, sir. Franklin Hayes wanted to pay respects, but he's not on any authorized list. No credentials, no family connection. I explained the restrictions. Hayes. Logan's breath caught. The name hit him like a physical blow. He'd heard it exactly once, 3 years ago, during a late-night conversation when General Connors had too much bourbon in him and started talking about Vietnam, about debts that couldn't be repaid and heroes who didn't want recognition. "Did he mention what unit?" Logan asked, though he already suspected the answer. "3rd Recon Battalion, sir. Charlie Company. Said it was a long time ago." Logan's blood went cold. 3rd Recon Battalion hadn't existed on paper since 1973. Officially, they'd never existed at all. But General Connors had mentioned that designation once in hushed tones when explaining why he'd never felt worthy of some of his medals. "I need to make a call," Logan said, pulling out his secure phone. Inside the reception tent, General Andrew Price, now a 4-star himself, Secretary of Defense Material, the kind of officer whose presence commanded rooms, was reviewing the CIC ceremonial schedule when his phone buzzed. Logan's voice came through tight with controlled urgency. "Sir, we have a situation. Franklin Hayes is here." Price went perfectly still. Around him, the conversation continued. Arrangements for the flag. Ceremony, coordination with the press pool, logistics for the foreign dignitaries. But Andrew Price heard none of it. He was 19 again, crawling through jungle mud with shrapnel in his leg and a radio operator who'd stopped breathing, waiting to die until a sergeant with steady hands and eyes like winter pulled them both. "Out of hell. Where?" Price's voice was barely a whisper. "Outside the main gate. Security won't let him in. He's not on any list." Price closed his eyes. 54 years he'd been waiting for this moment, hoping Franklin Hayes was still alive, still out there somewhere. Marcus had died without ever finding him, despite hiring private investigators and calling in favors from intelligence contacts. The one man they'd both wanted to thank had simply vanished after his discharge, disappeared into civilian life like smoke. "Sir?" Logan's voice brought him back to the present. "What are your orders?" Price looked around the tent at the carefully orchestrated ceremony, the protocols that governed every minute of the day, the expectations of a nation watching their heroes say goodbye to one of their own. Then he thought about a sergeant who'd saved 2 lives and refused to take credit, who'd carried wounded men to safety and declined the medal, who'd done what needed doing and asked for nothing in return. "I'll handle this personally," Price said, and the tone in his voice made Logan understand that something was about to change in ways the official program hadn't planned for. The ceremony would continue, but not the way anyone expected. Word traveled through the funeral reception like wildfire contained in whispers. Logan Marks had made discreet inquiries among the senior staff, and within 20 minutes, 3 different people had approached General Price with variations of the same question. "Sir, is there really someone outside who served with you and General Connors in Vietnam?" Price deflected each inquiry with practiced diplomatic silence, but he could feel the weight of curiosity building around him. Military ceremonies operated on precision and protocol, every minute scheduled, every participant accounted for, every deviation carefully managed. The presence of an unvetted individual, even one standing respectfully outside the gates, represented the kind of security anomaly that made colonels nervous and made the Secret Service reach for their radios. At 10:30 hours, Major General Patricia Chen, the ceremony's chief coordinator, approached Price with a clipboard and a concerned expression. "General, I understand there's an issue with someone claiming military service with the deceased. Should we have MP investigate?" "That won't be necessary," Price replied, but Chen pressed forward. "Sir, with respect, we have foreign dignitaries. Present, media coverage and specific security protocols. If this individual has legitimate claims to attend, we need documentation. If not, perhaps it's time to have him moved along." Price felt something cold settle in his chest. Moved along. As if Franklin Hayes was some kind of vagrant disrupting a society function rather than the man who'd made this entire ceremony possible by ensuring the guest of honor lived long enough to become a general. "I said I'll handle it," Price's voice carried enough steel to make Chen step back, but he could see the calculation in her eyes. She was thinking about liability, about unexplained variables, about the kind of career-ending mistakes that happened when security protocols were ignored, for sentimental reasons. Outside, Franklin hadn't moved from his position by the wall, but he'd noticed the increased attention. A military police jeep had parked nearby, its occupants maintaining casual surveillance while trying to appear nonchalant. A photographer with a telephoto lens had taken a few pictures from across the street, probably thinking the old man made for good color commentary, the forgotten veteran watching from the margins while the powerful mourned in comfort. Franklin understood the message. He was becoming a problem, a disruption to the carefully choreographed farewell. Part of him considered leaving, catching the next bus back to North Carolina and letting the ceremony proceed without complications. Marcus was gone, and standing in the cold watching from a distance wouldn't bring him back or change anything that had happened 54 years ago in the jungle. But then he thought about the letter in his jacket pocket, the one that had arrived 3 weeks ago, with Marcus's personal seal on the envelope. The letter that had brought him here, despite knowing he wouldn't be welcome, despite understanding that men like him didn't belong at events like this. "Frank," the letter had begun, "if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're probably standing somewhere you're not supposed to be, holding a flower and wondering if anyone remembers. I need you to know I never forgot. Not the night you pulled me out, not the fact that you saved Andrew Price too, though he was too young and too scared to remember much beyond the morphine. Not the way you refused every commendation and disappeared. Before anyone could properly thank you, I've spent 40 years looking for you. Not to parade you around or make speeches about heroism, but because some debts don't die with time, they grow heavier. If you come to my funeral, and I hope you do, know that you're the most important person there, whether they let you inside or not." Your friend, Marcus Franklin, pulled his jacket tighter against the autumn wind and stayed exactly where he was. Inside those gates, they were burying a 4-star general. But Franklin Hayes had come to say goodbye to the kid from Ohio who'd called him Sarge and wrote letters to his mother every Sunday until the day he died. He wasn't leaving. Not for protocol, not for security concerns, and not for the comfort of people who'd never had to choose between their own safety and someone else's life. The confrontation was coming, and Franklin could feel it building like pressure before a storm. At 11:15 hours, Major General Chen made her decision. She'd given General Price ample opportunity to address the situation through proper channels, and his continued resistance suggested emotional compromise, understandable given the circumstances, but unacceptable given the security implications. She activated her radio and called for the senior military police officer on site. Within minutes, Captain James Rodriguez approached the tent, his expression professionally neutral, but his posture indicating he already understood the nature of his assignment. "Ma'am, you wanted to see me?" "Captain, we have an individual outside the security perimeter who claims military service but lacks proper credentials for attendance. He's been there for over an hour, and his presence is creating complications. I need you to conduct a wellness check and, if necessary, escort him from the area." Rodriguez glanced toward the gates where Franklin remained stationed. "Understood, ma'am. Standard procedure?" Respectful, but firm. "This is a state funeral, and we can't have unauthorized personnel creating disruptions, regardless of claimed service history." Rodriguez nodded and began walking toward the entrance, his hand automatically checking the position of his radio and the flexibility clip on his service weapon. Standard crowd control protocol for a potentially difficult individual. General Price saw the MP captain heading for the gates and felt something snap inside his chest. For 54 years, he'd built a career on protocol, on following orders, on the careful navigation of military hierarchy and political necessity. He'd risen through the ranks by understanding when to speak and when to remain silent, when to push and when to yield. But watching Franklin Hayes about to be escorted from his best friend's funeral for the crime of not having the right paperwork was the moment Andrew Price decided that some things mattered more than protocol. He stood up from the head table, his movement sharp enough to draw attention from everyone in the immediate vicinity. Without a word of explanation to his staff, without consulting the ceremony coordinator, without regard for the carefully planned schedule, he walked directly toward the gates. "General Price," Logan Marks called after him. "Sir, where are you?" "Going." Price didn't answer. He was already outside the reception tent, moving with the kind of purposeful stride that made junior officers scramble out of the way. Behind him, he could hear the ripple of confusion spreading through the crowd, whispered questions, the rustle of programs, the subtle shift in attention that happened when someone deviated from expected behavior. Captain Rodriguez had just reached Franklin when he noticed the four-star general approaching from behind. The MP captain came to attention instinctively, but his position was awkward, caught between executing orders from a major general and the sudden presence of someone who outranked everyone at the ceremony except the Secretary of Defense. "Captain," Price called out, his voice carrying clearly across the distance. "Stand down." Rodriguez hesitated, caught between competing authorities. "Sir, I have orders from Major General Chen to—" "I'm countermanding those orders." Price's voice was steel wrapped in silk. "Return to your duties." The captain looked back toward the ceremony tent, where he could see Chen watching the exchange with obvious displeasure, then back at the four-star general, whose expression suggested that further discussion would be career-limiting. "He chose the path of survival." "Yes, sir." Rodriguez executed a sharp about-face and retreated, leaving Price and Franklin alone at the gates. They looked at each other through the iron bars, the general in his perfectly tailored dress uniform, with its rows of ribbons and campaign medals, and the sergeant in his faded wool jacket with its single unit patch. Between them lay 5 decades, 2 wars, countless promotions and commendations, but also a debt that had never been repaid and a friendship that had never been properly acknowledged. "Hello, Andrew," Franklin said quietly. Price's composure maintained. Through decades of command responsibility and political pressure, finally cracked. His eyes filled with tears he'd been holding back since 1971, and his voice shook as he replied, "Hello, Frank. We've been waiting for you." Behind them, the entire ceremony had ground to a halt as 300 guests tried to understand why their presiding general was crying at a security gate, talking to a man nobody recognized. The breaking point had arrived, and nothing would ever be the same. General Price reached into his jacket and withdrew a key, not the ceremonial type used for ribbon cuttings or symbolic gestures, but the actual functional master key to Quantico National Cemetery's gates. As the commanding officer for the ceremony, he had access to everything, including the authority to override security protocols when circumstances warranted. The click of the lock turning was barely audible, but it echoed like thunder through the suddenly silent crowd. Price opened the gate and stepped outside the secured perimeter, joining Franklin on the public side of the barrier. "Sir," Major General Chen's voice carried sharp disapproval as she approached the gate. "General Price, you're compromising security protocols. This individual hasn't been properly vetted, and—" "This individual," Price interrupted, his voice carrying the kind of command authority that made colonels step backwards, "is Sergeant Franklin Hayes, 3rd Reconnaissance Battalion. He saved my life and the life of General Connors in February 1968 during operations that remain classified to this day. He's been invited to this ceremony by both of us, and the only reason he wasn't on your list is because we've been trying to find him for 40 years. The words hit the crowd like a physical wave. Cameras that had been respectfully lowered suddenly lifted. Phones appeared in hands. The carefully managed information flow of a state funeral had just been shattered by the revelation that the most important guest was the one they'd been trying to keep out. Chen's face flushed red with a combination of embarrassment and anger. "Sir, I had no way of knowing—" "Of course you didn't," Price replied, his tone softening slightly. "Because men like Sergeant Hayes don't appear in official records. They don't have their pictures in history books. They don't get invited to White House dinners or Pentagon briefings. They just do what needs to be done and disappear back into civilian life, hoping nobody makes a fuss about it." Franklin shifted uncomfortably under the sudden attention. "Andrew, you don't need to—" "Yes, I do." Price turned back to the crowd, raising his voice so everyone could hear. "For 54 years I've worn uniforms and received honors and given speeches about service and sacrifice, but every medal on my chest, every promotion I've received, every life I've had the privilege to lead as an officer in the United States Army, all of it exists because this man carried me out of a jungle when I was too young and stupid to save myself." The silence was absolute. 300 people, including some of the most powerful figures in American military and political life, stood frozen as they witnessed something unprecedented. A 4-star general publicly acknowledging a debt that transcended rank, protocol, and procedure. Logan Marks, understanding the magnitude of what was happening, began making rapid calculations. The ceremony could be salvaged, but it would require flexibility and quick thinking. He activated his radio and began issuing quiet orders to the support staff. Adjust the seating arrangements, prepare an additional place at the head table, briefly, the press pool on the developing situation. Meanwhile, Chen was frantically consulting her clipboard, trying to determine how to incorporate an unplanned guest into a meticulously orchestrated event. But Price was already moving beyond her authority. "Frank," he said, turning back to Franklin with an expression of profound gratitude, "Marcus left specific instructions. If we ever found you, if you ever came to his funeral, you were to be treated not as a guest, but as family. You were to sit in the front row, and you were to receive the flag." Franklin's face went pale. "I can't accept that. I didn't do anything special. I just—" "You saved 2 lives," Price interrupted gently. 2 lives that went on to serve this country for a combined 90 years. 2 lives that trained thousands of other soldiers, that made decisions affecting millions of people, that helped keep America safe through 4 decades of conflict and peace. The ripple effects of what you did on one night in 1968 are impossible to calculate. The crowd began to shift as people realized they were witnessing something historic, not just the funeral of a general, but the long overdue recognition of a hero who'd spent half a century in the shadows. Franklin looked at the faces staring at him with newfound respect and understanding, then back at Andrew Price, who was no longer the scared kid he'd pulled from a burning helicopter, but who still looked at him with the same gratitude that had never dimmed. "All right," Franklin said quietly. "But I keep the flower," Price smiled. The first genuine smile anyone had seen from him all day. "Wouldn't have it any other way, Sergeant." The fight back had begun, and it was already won. As Franklin walked through the gates of Quantico National Cemetery, something extraordinary happened. The crowd began to rise. It started with the veterans in the front rows, men and women who recognized the weight of what they were witnessing. They stood not because protocol demanded it, but because instinct required it, the same instinct that made soldiers salute. Medal of Honor recipients, the same recognition of sacrifice that transcended paperwork and procedure. The movement spread through the assembly like a slow wave. Active duty officers, defense contractors, political appointees, and foreign dignitaries all rose to their feet as a 73-year-old man in a faded uniform walked toward the front of the ceremony, guided by a 4-star general who had just upended every security protocol to right a 50-year-old wrong. Major General Chen watched the scene unfold with growing horror. Her carefully planned event was disintegrating into something uncontrolled, something that could go viral on social media within hours and generate the kind of attention that military public affairs officers spent sleepless nights trying to avoid. She activated her radio and began damage control procedures. This is command control to media relations. We have a developing situation requiring immediate narrative management. Prepare statements regarding unscheduled ceremony modifications. And she paused, watching Franklin take his seat in the front row, directly next to where Marcus Connors' widow sat. The elderly woman, who had been briefed on every aspect of the ceremony except this one, looked confused until Price leaned down and whispered something in her ear. Mrs. Connors' expression changed instantly from confusion to recognition to something deeper, a kind of profound gratitude mixed with grief. She reached over and took Franklin's hand, squeezing it gently while tears streamed down her face. Chen realized with sinking certainty that there would be no controlling this narrative. The image of a general's widow embracing the unknown veteran was already being captured by dozens of cameras, and the story would write itself. The hero they forgot, the debt finally acknowledged, the friendship that transcended death itself. Her radio crackled with urgent requests for information from her superior officers, but Chen found herself unable to provide coherent answers. How do you explain that the entire premise of a state funeral had just shifted? That the guest of honor was no longer the deceased general, but the living veteran nobody had bothered to invite? Meanwhile, the ceremony itself was transforming in real time. Logan Marks, demonstrating the kind of adaptability that made him an effective aide-de-camp, had rapidly restructured the speaking order to accommodate the new circumstances. Instead of the planned series of formal eulogies, he'd arranged for General Price to deliver a single, comprehensive address that would explain the presence of Franklin Hayes and contextualize his relationship with the deceased. The press pool, initially frustrated by the deviation from their prepared talking points, began to understand they were witnessing something potentially historic. Phones were raised, live streams activated, and social media feeds began buzzing with real-time updates about the mysterious veteran who had somehow stopped a general's funeral. But the real downfall was happening in the minds of everyone present. The comfortable assumption that they understood military history, that they knew who the heroes were and why they deserved recognition, was crumbling. If Franklin Hayes, clearly a man of profound importance to both the deceased general and the presiding officer, could stand outside the gates for over an hour without anyone recognizing his significance, what other stories had been lost? What other debts remained unpaid? Franklin himself seemed oblivious to the chaos his presence had created. He sat quietly in the front row, the wilted lily still clutched in his hand, his attention focused entirely on the flag-draped casket that held the remains of his friend. The ceremony could rage around him, protocols could shatter, careers could be made or broken by the decisions of the next few minutes. None of it mattered to him. He had come to say goodbye to Marcus, and everything else was just noise. The establishment's careful control over the narrative was dissolving, and there was no stopping it now. General Andrew Price approached the podium with the weight of 5 decades pressing down on his shoulders. The original eulogy, carefully crafted, politically appropriate, professionally dignified, lay forgotten in his jacket pocket. Instead, he looked out at the assembled crowd and decided to tell the truth. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the silent cemetery, "you came here today expecting to honor the memory of General Marcus Connors, and we will. But first, you need to understand that everything General Connors achieved in his 47-year military career, every battle he won, every soldier he trained, every life he saved, happened because of the man sitting in our front row." The crowd leaned forward, sensing they were about to hear something unprecedented. February 12, 1968, Firebase Kaysan. Second Lieutenant Marcus Connors and I, then Second Lieutenant Andrew Price, were 21 years old and 6 weeks into our first combat deployment. We thought we understood war because we'd read about it at West Point. We thought we were prepared because we'd completed all the training. We were wrong. Franklin kept his eyes fixed on the casket, but everyone else was watching Price, who had abandoned all pretense of military formality and was speaking with the raw honesty of a man unburdening himself of a lifetime secret. At 0347 hours, our position was overrun. Our radio operator was killed, our medic was wounded, and we were cut off from our unit with no way to call for support. We were going to die in that jungle, 2 kids who'd never get the chance to become the officers we thought we were meant to be. The silence was so complete that the autumn wind rustling through the oak trees sounded like applause. And then Sergeant Franklin Hayes appeared, not assigned to our unit, not following orders, not looking for recognition. He saw 2 soldiers in trouble and decided that was enough reason to risk his life. He carried Marcus through 400 yards of enemy territory while I limped behind, both of us bleeding and barely conscious. He got us to safety, refused medical attention for his own wounds, and declined to file a report about what he'd done. Price's voice broke slightly, but he continued. "For 54 years, Marcus and I have carried the knowledge that our lives, our families, our careers, our service to this country all exist because one man did what was right when no one was watching and no one would ever know." Major General Chen, watching from the side of the ceremony, realized that her career concerns had become irrelevant. This wasn't a public relations crisis anymore. It was American history being written in real time. The Army gave Marcus and me medals for our service in Vietnam. Price continued, his voice growing stronger. "We received commendations for leadership, for valor, for distinguished service." Marcus became a general, commanded divisions, shaped military strategy for 3 decades. I followed a similar path. Between us, we've received dozens of awards, hundreds of ribbons, recognition from presidents and foreign governments. He paused, looking directly at Franklin, "But every single honor we ever received belongs to the man who made our continued service possible. Every life we saved as officers, every soldier we trained, every mission we completed, the credit belongs to Sergeant Hayes, who asked for nothing and received nothing except the knowledge that he'd done his duty." Franklin shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly wishing he could disappear, but Price wasn't finished. Marcus spent the last 10 years of his life trying to find Franklin Hayes. He hired private investigators, called in favors with intelligence agencies, posted notices in veteran publications. "He wanted to do this." Price gestured to the assembled crowd, the ceremony, the recognition, while he was still alive to see it. He wanted Franklin to know that some debts don't diminish with time, they compound. The general's voice rose to address the entire assembly. "You are witnessing the correction of a 54-year-old oversight. You are seeing what happens when America finally recognizes a hero who never wanted recognition, but who deserves it more than anyone else in this cemetery." Price stepped away from the podium and walked directly to Franklin, who looked up with eyes that held 5 decades of carefully guarded emotion. In front of 300 witnesses, the 4-star general came to attention and delivered the sharpest, most respectful salute of his career. "Thank you, Sergeant Hayes," he said, his voice thick with gratitude. "For saving our lives, for serving your country, for showing us what real heroism looks like." Franklin stood slowly, his own military bearing reasserting itself after decades of civilian life. He returned the salute with equal precision, and in that moment everyone present understood they were witnessing something that transcended protocol, politics, and procedure. They were seeing 2 old soldiers finally say the words that should have been spoken 54 years ago. 6 months later, Franklin Hayes received an envelope with the presidential seal. Inside was a simple invitation. "The President of the United States requests the honor of your presence at a ceremony recognizing extraordinary service to the nation." He almost threw it away. The ceremony itself was quiet by White House standards, held in the Rose Garden with only a handful of witnesses, no press pool, no television cameras, no social media live stream. Just Franklin, General Price, Mrs. Connors, and a few military officials who understood the significance of what they were witnessing. The President, briefed on the full story by the Secretary of Defense, kept his remarks brief. "Some heroes serve in daylight with the world watching. Others serve in darkness with only their conscience as witness. Today we honor a man who chose service over recognition, duty over glory, and who spent 50 years carrying secrets that the rest of us needed to hear." The Medal of Honor ceremony lasted less than 10 minutes. Franklin accepted the award with the same quiet dignity he'd shown at the cemetery, shook the president's hand, and politely declined the reception that followed. He had a bus to catch back to North Carolina. But the real aftermath wasn't measured in medals or ceremonies. Within weeks of the Quantico funeral video going viral, the Veterans Administration began receiving calls from family members asking about relatives who'd served in classified units, operations that didn't appear in official records, missions that existed only in the memories of aging soldiers. The Franklin Hayes Center for Military Recognition opened 18 months later, funded by donations from people who'd been moved by the story of the forgotten hero. It became a clearinghouse for locating and honoring veterans whose service had been classified, overlooked, or simply lost in the bureaucratic shuffle of multiple conflicts. General Price, approaching retirement, became the center's first director. His last official act as an active duty officer was establishing a new protocol. Every military funeral would now include a provision for unscheduled recognition of previously unacknowledged service members. Translation: they would never again turn away a Franklin Hayes. Franklin himself returned to his quiet life in North Carolina, tending his small garden and volunteering with the local VA hospital. He kept the Medal of Honor in a shoebox in his closet, alongside Marcus's letters and a pressed lily from that autumn day at Quantico. Visitors who expected to find him transformed by recognition were disappointed. He remained exactly what he'd always been, a man who did what needed doing and asked for nothing in return. But sometimes, on particularly quiet evenings, he would sit on his porch and remember the weight of Andrew Price's hand on his shoulder, the tears in Marcus Connor's widow's eyes, and the sound of 300 people rising to their feet for a hero they'd never heard of until that moment. He'd done his duty. He'd kept his promise to Marcus. And for the first time in 54 years, the debt was finally balanced. The last entry in Marcus Connor's personal journal, discovered after his death, read simply, "Some friendships transcend death. Some debts can only be paid by remembering." Today I remembered Franklin Hayes, and tomorrow, God willing, America will too. America did remember. And in remembering Franklin, they learned something important about heroism. It doesn't always wear ribbons and medals. Sometimes it just carries a flower and stands quietly outside the gates, waiting for someone to notice that not all the heroes made it inside. In the end, that was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.